The Kepler Military Academy on Centauri Prime had a reputation that preceded it like a bad smell at a diplomatic dinner. Founded 3 centuries ago by the Galactic Defense Consortium, it was where the best and brightest of 17 different species came to learn the fine art of organized mayhem. The campus itself was a monument to interspecies cooperation, assuming you considered towering spires that could withstand orbital bombardment and training facilities that could simulate the destruction of entire star systems as symbols of unity. Professor Xen'thak adjusted his ceremonial combat harness because apparently even in academia, looking ready for war was important, and surveyed his advanced military history class. The Valkyrie instructor's 4 eyes swept across rows of eager cadets representing the cream of galactic military potential. There were the usual suspects, a cluster of Thurian cadets with their trademark aggressive postures, their chitinous armor gleaming under the artificial lighting. 3 Zephyrian students floated in their specialized hover chairs, their translucent forms shimmering with barely contained energy. A pair of Gornaki twins sat ramrod straight, their stone-like features betraying nothing, which was pretty much their species' default expression for everything from mild interest to apocalyptic rage. And then there was the human. Corporal Maddox Chen sat in the back corner, looking about as threatening as a houseplant. Average height, unremarkable build, with the kind of face that would blend into any crowd across the galaxy. He had that peculiar human habit of appearing simultaneously alert and half asleep, a contradiction that had puzzled xenobiologists for decades. While his fellow cadets maintained the rigid postures drilled into them by their respective military traditions, Chen lounged in his chair like he was waiting for a bus that might or might not arrive sometime this decade. The human contingent at Kepler had always been something of an oddity. Humans were relatively new to the galactic stage, barely 3 centuries since first contact, and their military contributions were often viewed with the kind of benevolent condescension usually reserved for particularly clever pets. Sure, they had managed not to blow themselves up during their nuclear phase, which was more than could be said for the Corinthians, but their tactics were considered charmingly primitive by galactic standards. Effective in their own quaint way, perhaps, but hardly worthy of serious academic study. Professor Xen'thak activated the classroom's holographic projector with a gesture that had taken him years to perfect for maximum dramatic effect. The sterile academic environment dissolved, replaced by the jagged peaks and blood-soaked valleys of Epsilon Ridge. The simulation was flawless, rendering every detail with the kind of obsessive precision that military historians demanded and taxpayers funded without really understanding why. Today, we examine the Battle of Epsilon Ridge, Xen'thak announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had written 3 definitive texts on tactical analysis and wasn't about to let anyone forget it. This engagement, fought 17 years ago during the Kryllian incursion, represents a fascinating study in human military psychology and the intersection of desperation with tactical innovation. The holographic battlefield materialized around them, a masterpiece of recreational trauma. Epsilon Ridge rose before them like a monument to geological hostility, jagged stone spires that seemed designed specifically to make military operations as miserable as possible. The simulation captured every detail: the thin atmosphere that made breathing an adventure, the unpredictable weather patterns that could shift from scorching heat to freezing rain in minutes, and the particular shade of rust-red soil that came from a combination of iron oxide and centuries of various species bleeding on it. The strategic situation was, by any rational analysis, hopeless, the professor continued, clearly enjoying the academic equivalent of a horror story. 237 human colonial marines, cut off from reinforcement, facing a Kryllian Horde force estimated at over 4,000 warriors. The humans had established a defensive perimeter here. He gestured, and tactical markers appeared with inadequate supplies, damaged equipment, and wounded personnel comprising nearly 30% of their effective strength. The Thurian cadets leaned forward with interest. Hopeless last stands were their cultural equivalent of romantic poetry, and they appreciated the theoretical beauty of tactical impossibility. One of them, Cadet Vextar, raised a clawed hand. Professor, what was the human command structure's reasoning for not attempting a strategic withdrawal? Surely preservation of forces would have been the logical priority. Xen'thak's expression suggested he had been waiting for exactly this question. An excellent point, Cadet Vextar. Human military doctrine of the period emphasized what they termed mission completion over force preservation. In this case, they were tasked with holding the ridge to prevent Kryllian access to the Helios Valley settlements. The human commander apparently considered the civilian casualties from evacuation failure to be unacceptable. A Zephyrian cadet, her energy form pulsing with curiosity, interjected with the kind of question that showed why her species had mastered faster-than-light communication before developing the wheel. But, Professor, the mathematical probability of mission success was effectively zero. How does one justify tactical decisions based on emotional rather than logical parameters? That, Cadet Xen'thak, is precisely what makes this battle worthy of study. Xen'thak replied. Human military behavior often defies conventional strategic analysis. They appear to operate under the lost assumption that statistical impossibility is merely a starting point for negotiation with reality. The simulation began its grim recreation of the battle's opening phase. Kryllian Horde warriors materialized across the valley floor, massive, insectoid creatures whose approach to warfare could be charitably described as enthusiastic and more accurately termed utterly terrifying. They moved with the coordination of a species that had evolved specifically to overwhelm their enemies through sheer, relentless aggression. Their chittering battle cries filled the air, a sound that every species in the galaxy had learned to associate with very bad days ahead. The human defensive positions looked pitifully inadequate by comparison. Hastily constructed barriers, improvised cover, and the kind of desperate field modifications that spoke of soldiers who had run out of regulation solutions and moved on to creative profanity-enhanced alternatives. The Marines themselves appeared surprisingly calm for people in the process of being historically significant, which was either admirable or deeply concerning, depending on your perspective. Notice the human defensive arrangement, Xen'thak pointed out with professional interest. Rather than concentrating their forces in a unified position, they established multiple overlapping fields of fire, tactically sound, but it required a level of coordination that should have been impossible given their communication limitations and the stress of combat. Cadet Vextar's mandibles clicked in what passed for Thurian contemplation. Their positioning suggests they anticipated the Kryllian tendency toward frontal assault, but how could they have known the specific approach vectors? Human intelligence gathering is often underestimated, the professor replied. They have a peculiar talent for acquiring information through methods that appear random, but prove surprisingly effective. Some theorists suggest it's less intelligence gathering than applied intuition, though that raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of tactical precognition. The battle simulation progressed with the inevitability of a very expensive disaster. Wave after wave of Kryllian warriors crashed against the human positions, each assault reducing the Marine numbers while barely denting the seemingly endless horde. The simulation's audio systems helpfully provided the complete sensory experience. The thunder of gunfire, the screams of wounded, the distinctive sound that Kryllian warriors made when expressing their professional disappointment with human resistance. But it was during the battle's most desperate phase that the real star of the show made his entrance. The simulation focused on a particular section of the defensive line, where a Kryllian breakthrough had left 17 Marines wounded and scattered across exposed ground. According to every tactical manual ever written, these soldiers were effectively casualties, brave sacrifices whose loss was regrettable but strategically inevitable. The textbook solution was to write them off and focus resources on maintaining the primary defensive position. Humans, as it turned out, hadn't read those particular textbooks. A single figure emerged from the defensive positions, moving with purposeful disregard for the minor detail that the area between him and the wounded Marines was currently experiencing what military historians politely termed maximum hostile fire density. The medic, because of course it was a medic, because humans had apparently decided that their medical personnel should also moonlight as tactical impossibilities sprinted across open ground that was being systematically perforated by Kryllian weapons. This is the moment that military analysts still debate, Professor Xen'thak said, his academic composure barely containing what might have been actual awe. The human medic's run across 200 meters of open ground under direct fire represents either the most tactically brilliant or most strategically insane individual action in recorded military history. Possibly both. The simulation rendered every detail with uncomfortable precision. The medic moved in a pattern that seemed random, but somehow avoided the worst of the incoming fire, weaving between explosions and weapon bursts with the kind of luck that made statisticians weep into their probability matrices. He reached the first wounded Marine and began what could only be described as combat medicine surgical procedures performed while someone was actively trying to kill you, which was exactly as difficult as it sounded. Cadet Xen'thak's energy form flickered with confusion. Professor, the medical procedures being performed appear to exceed the capabilities of standard field equipment. How is the subject maintaining surgical precision while under direct fire? That question has puzzled military medical experts for nearly 2 decades, Xen'thak admitted. Analysis of the battle footage suggests the medic was improvising surgical instruments from battlefield debris and performing procedures that shouldn't have been possible given the available resources. Some theories suggest extreme adrenaline response, others point to specialized human training methodologies we don't fully understand. The simulation continued its relentless recreation of organized chaos. The medic worked his way from soldier to soldier, each rescue seeming more impossible than the last. He dragged a Marine to safety while using his medical kit one-handed, the other hand somehow maintaining pressure on an arterial wound. He performed an emergency tracheotomy using what appeared to be a sharpened piece of Kryllian armor while simultaneously directing suppressive fire from the conscious wounded. One of the Gornaki twins, Cadet Thexel, spoke for the first time in the semester. The individual's tactical awareness appears to exceed normal human parameters. He is tracking multiple threat vectors while maintaining focus on medical procedures. This suggests either enhanced cognitive processing or, what Cadet? Professor Xen'thak prompted, or extensive prior experience with exactly this type of combat scenario, which would be statistically improbable for a human of his apparent age and rank. The battle's climax approached with the dramatic timing that reality sometimes managed when it was trying to impress the history books. The medic had successfully evacuated 43 wounded Marines, turning what should have been a tactical disaster into merely a very expensive inconvenience. But the Kryllian forces had finally adapted to his tactics, coordinating their fire to pin him down in an exposed position with the last group of wounded. This was the moment that had spawned a dozen doctoral dissertations and at least 3 different schools of tactical philosophy. With Kryllian warriors closing from multiple directions and his ammunition exhausted, the medic made a decision that military analysts were still trying to categorize. He grabbed the weapons from the wounded Marines around him and began what could only be described as therapeutic violence, using suppressive fire as a form of medical treatment, keeping the enemy at bay through the sheer audacity of refusing to acknowledge that his situation was hopeless. The simulation showed him moving between wounded soldiers, coordinating their remaining firepower into a defensive pattern that had no business working. He was simultaneously treating wounds, directing fire, and apparently engaging in what the battle recordings suggested was therapeutic profanity of remarkable creativity and effectiveness. In the back corner of the classroom, Corporal Maddox Chen shifted slightly in his chair. It was the first time he had moved during the entire presentation, and something about the movement caught Professor Xen'thak's attention. Chen was watching the simulation with an expression that was difficult to read, not the academic interest of his classmates, but something more personal, more immediate. The simulation reached its historical conclusion with the arrival of human reinforcements, who found the medic still conscious, still functional, and still treating wounded soldiers despite having sustained enough injuries to hospitalize most species for months. The final casualty count told the story, Of 47 Marines who should have died in the exposed position, 46 survived to fight another day. The medic himself had been wounded 7 times, twice seriously, and had somehow managed to perform field surgery on himself while maintaining his tactical position. The Battle of Epsilon Ridge became a turning point in human military reputation. Professor Xen'thak concluded as the simulation faded back to the sterile classroom environment. This single action demonstrated capabilities that forced a complete reevaluation of human tactical potential. The identity of the medic was never officially disclosed, but his actions became the foundation for current human military medical doctrine. The class sat in contemplative silence, each species processing the demonstration according to their own cultural frameworks. The Thurians were calculating the honor-to-survival ratios. The Zephyrians were trying to reconcile the logical impossibilities they had witnessed. The Gornaki twins were probably thinking about stone-related metaphors for human stubbornness. It was Cadet Vextar who broke the silence with a question that demonstrated why Turians made excellent military analysts when they weren't busy planning glorious deaths. Professor, the simulation showed the medic using what appeared to be a makeshift tourniquet constructed from enemy equipment. Can you provide details on this improvisation? Professor Xen'thak consulted his notes. The official reports mention improvised medical equipment but lack specific details. The battlefield forensics suggested creative use of available materials, but the exact methodologies weren't documented. From the back corner came a quiet voice that somehow carried clearly across the classroom. It was a Kryllian officer's ceremonial belt. The material was perfect for tourniquets, and the buckle mechanism provided the right kind of pressure adjustment. Every head in the classroom turned to stare at Corporal Chen, who had spoken with the casual authority of someone correcting a minor factual error. He seemed oblivious to the sudden attention, still staring at the space where the holographic battlefield had been. Professor Xen'thak's 4 eyes focused on the human cadet with new interest. That's quite specific, Corporal. The official reports didn't include such details. Chen shrugged, a peculiarly human gesture that managed to convey both acknowledgement and dismissal simultaneously. Official reports never include the useful details. They don't mention that the belt material was synthetic leather with fiber optic threads for ceremonial displays, which made it strong enough for tourniquets but flexible enough not to cut circulation completely. Standard issue human belts would have been too rigid. The professor's expression shifted from academic interest to something approaching suspicion. And how would you know about the specific properties of Kryllian ceremonial equipment? Same way you'd know about the tactical layout if you'd been there, Chen replied, his tone suggesting that this should have been obvious. The official maps show the ridge running east-west, but there was actually a 15-degree deviation that created a blind spot in the southern approach. That's why the medic could use that particular route for the first 3 evacuations. Cadet Zixara's energy form pulsed with what might have been excitement or confusion. Corporal Chen, are you suggesting the tactical recreations are inaccurate? Not inaccurate, Chen said, finally looking directly at his classmates. Just incomplete. The simulation doesn't show the weather deterioration that started about 2 hours into the engagement. Temperature dropped 20 degrees, and the wind patterns created dust storms that limited visibility to about 50 meters. That's actually why the medic's approach worked. He was using the weather as concealment. Professor Xen'thak was now openly staring at his human student. In 3 decades of teaching military history, he had never encountered a cadet who corrected historical recreations with this level of detail. Corporal, these are very specific observations about environmental conditions that weren't recorded in any official documentation. Chen nodded as if this was perfectly reasonable. Environmental conditions rarely make it into after-action reports unless they directly affected casualties. The dust storms were just a tactical factor, not a strategic consideration, but they were crucial for understanding how the medical evacuations were possible. One of the Thurian cadets leaned forward aggressively. Human, are you claiming superior knowledge of this engagement based on theoretical analysis? Not theoretical, Chen replied mildly. The dust tasted like iron oxide mixed with organic compounds from the local vegetation. Very distinctive. And the wind patterns were consistent with the seasonal atmospheric movements on worlds with that specific orbital characteristics. You could predict the storm timing if you knew what to look for. The classroom had fallen into the kind of silence that usually preceded either academic breakthroughs or disciplinary action. Professor Xen'thak found himself in the unusual position of questioning his own expertise, while simultaneously wondering if his most unremarkable student was actually some kind of savant. "Corporal Chen," he said carefully, "you seem remarkably well informed about the tactical and environmental details of this engagement. Might I ask what sources you've used for your research?" Chen looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Research? Professor, I didn't research anything. I just remember the way things actually happened." The statement hung in the air, like an unexploded ordnance, waiting for someone to jostle it the wrong way. Professor Xen'thak felt his academic worldview beginning to develop structural cracks. "You remember?" he repeated slowly. "Sure," Chen said, reaching up to rub his left shoulder with the absent gesture of someone dealing with chronic pain. "Still got shrapnel in there from the third Kryllian assault wave. Piece of their explosive ammunition casing. Military medical said it was too close to nerve clusters to remove safely, so I just learned to live with it." The classroom achieved a level of silence that approached the theoretical perfection of deep space. Every cadet, regardless of species, was staring at the unremarkable human in the back corner, who had just casually revealed that he was not, in fact, a student learning about military history, but rather a living piece of it. Professor Xen'thak's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a Valkyrie stress response that he hadn't experienced since his combat days. "Corporal Chen, are you saying that you were present at the Battle of Epsilon Ridge?" "Present?" Chen seemed to find the phrasing amusing. "Professor, I spent 14 hours dragging wounded Marines out of that death trap, while Kryllian warriors tried to turn me into a field ration. I'd say I was more than just present." Cadet Vextar's mandibles were clicking so rapidly it sounded like applause. "You're claiming to be the medic? The human whose actions are studied in every military academy across the galaxy?" Chen winced slightly, whether from the shoulder pain or the attention. "I never claimed to be anything special. I was just the guy who happened to be carrying the medical kit when everything went sideways. Somebody had to keep the wounded Marines alive long enough for reinforcements to arrive." The professor's academic mind was struggling to process this revelation like a computer trying to run software designed for a completely different operating system. The legendary medic of Epsilon Ridge was sitting in his classroom, taking notes on his own tactical decisions, and apparently finding the whole situation mildly tedious. "But the reports," Professor Xen'thak stammered, his usual professorial authority evaporating like water on a hot plasma conduit. "The analysis, the tactical studies, were written by people who weren't there." Chen finished gently. "Look, Professor, I'm not criticizing the academic analysis. But when you're getting shot at by giant space insects, you don't really think about how your actions will look in historical simulation. You just focus on keeping people alive and trying not to die yourself." One of the Gornaki twins spoke up, his stone-like features somehow managing to convey bewilderment. "But the tactical brilliance, the strategic insights, the impossible medical procedures," Chen actually laughed, a sound that seemed completely out of place in the academic setting. "Tactical brilliance. I was scared out of my mind for 14 hours straight. The only strategy I had was don't let anyone die on my watch. As for the impossible medical procedures," he shrugged again. "When someone's bleeding out in front of you, impossible becomes negotiable very quickly." Professor Xen'thak was experiencing the academic equivalent of existential crisis. 17 years of teaching this battle as a masterpiece of human tactical innovation, and it turned out to be the result of one terrified medic who was too stubborn to let people die. The theoretical frameworks, the strategic analysis, the careful study of innovative combat medicine, all of it based on what the human casually described as 14 hours of improvised panic. "Corporal," he said slowly, "do you realize that your actions at Epsilon Ridge are considered one of the finest examples of braiding SETI in tactical medicine in galactic military history?" That your techniques are taught in advanced military medical courses across 17 different species. Chen looked genuinely surprised. Really? I figured they'd have developed better methods by now. Most of what I did was just field expedient solutions to immediate problems. Nothing revolutionary, just practical applications of basic medical training under suboptimal conditions. Cadet Zyke's era's energy form was practically vibrating with excitement. Suboptimal conditions. You performed surgery while under direct fire. You treated 47 critical patients with improvised equipment. You established tactical coordination while maintaining medical focus. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds impressive, Chen admitted. But at the time, it was mostly just a very long, very stressful day at the office. The kind where you really question your career choices but don't have time to do anything about it. The professor found himself in the bizarre position of having his expertise corrected by its own subject matter. It was like teaching a class on ancient literature and discovering that one of your students was Homer, casually mentioning that the Iliad was actually based on a weekend that got slightly out of hand. Corporal Chen, he said formally, would you be willing to provide additional insights into the tactical and medical aspects of the engagement? For academic purposes, of course. Chen considered this, with the same thoughtful expression he might use when deciding what to have for lunch. I suppose I could share some details that didn't make it into the official reports, though I should warn you, reality is usually messier and less heroic than the academic analysis suggests. And so began the most unusual military history lesson in the Academy's 300-year existence. Professor Xen'thak found himself taking notes while his student, who was simultaneously the subject of study, corrected decades of tactical analysis with the casual authority of personal experience. The human described the actual sequence of medical evacuations, explaining how the dust storms had created visibility conditions that made the runs possible. He detailed the improvised surgical techniques that had been necessitated by equipment failures and resource shortages. He provided tactical insights that overturned established theories about human military decision-making, all delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing routine maintenance procedures. The other cadets listened with the fascination of people watching their understanding of reality undergo scheduled demolition. The legendary medic of Epsilon Ridge wasn't a tactical genius or a strategic mastermind. He was just a competent professional who had been placed in an impossible situation and had chosen to treat impossibility as a technical challenge rather than a philosophical barrier. As the class period drew to a close, Professor Xen'thak found himself facing a crisis of academic identity. How do you maintain scholarly objectivity when your primary source is sitting in the back row, casually correcting your interpretations of his own heroic actions? Corporal Chen, he said finally, why didn't you mention your involvement in this battle when you enrolled in this course? Chen looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Because it wasn't relevant to the coursework? I'm here to learn about military history and tactical analysis from an academic perspective. My personal experiences are just data points. I figured learning about the theoretical frameworks would help me understand the bigger picture. The statement was so thoroughly, incomprehensibly human that every alien in the classroom felt their understanding of human psychology shift slightly off its axis. The idea of studying academic analysis of your own legendary actions, because you wanted to understand the theoretical context, was the kind of logical pretzel that only humans seemed capable of creating. Professor Xen'thak realized that he would need to completely revise his course materials, his teaching methods, and possibly his entire approach to military history. Having a living legend casually correcting your textbook interpretations of his own actions was going to require some significant pedagogical adjustments. As the cadets filed out of the classroom, each species processing the revelation according to their own cultural frameworks, Corporal Maddox Chen gathered his notes with the same unremarkable efficiency he brought to everything else. The most studied individual action in recent galactic military history had been performed by someone who treated legendary status as a minor inconvenience and preferred to sit in the back row taking notes. Professor Xen'thak watched his most famous student leave the classroom and wondered if this was how academic careers ended, not with dramatic discoveries or groundbreaking research, but with the quiet realization that reality was far more interesting and considerably more humble than theoretical analysis had suggested. The next day, every military academy in the galaxy would receive updated course materials for their tactical medicine programs. The official description would mention new insights into the Battle of Epsilon Ridge, based on recently available primary source materials. What it wouldn't mention was that the primary source was a corporal who had spent the entire semester quietly correcting historical inaccuracies while working on his assignment notebooks. Such was the nature of human heroism, extraordinary actions performed by ordinary people who were primarily concerned with getting through the day without anyone dying on their watch. It was, Professor Xen'thak reflected, both the most inspiring and most terrifying thing about humans, their complete inability to recognize that they were doing anything particularly remarkable. The legend of Epsilon Ridge would continue to be studied and analyzed across the galaxy. But now, it would be taught with the understanding that heroism often came disguised as professional competence, and that the most extraordinary actions were frequently performed by people who considered them simply part of doing their job properly. In the end, that might have been the most human thing of all,